What do these two people have in common? Well, if you grew up in the West, a country like the US, you see two black men. If you grew up in South Africa, you would probably see a black man and a colored man, two different racial categorizations. Now, what do these two have in common? For the second photo, you may see a white man and an Arab man, but according to the US racial census, both of these men are white. Some may even use the term Caucasian, a word in the US that means white, even though Khabib, a real Caucasian, would probably get hate crimed in the US post 9/11. Race is defined as any one of the groups that humans are often divided into based on physical traits, regarded as common among people of shared ancestry. Basically, meaning race is how we categorize people based on our perception of what people of that quote unquote race would look like. In the US, because of the history of the transatlantic slave trade and their categories of race, if you had any characteristics that looked black African, even though you were mixed with other groups, you were considered black. Someone like Drake, whose father is African American and mother is Ashkenazi Jewish, the US or even Canada sees as black. Even though genetically it is very likely he is probably around 40% or less sub Saharan African, because of the fact that African Americans like his father, are on average 75% African, with the rest being European. If Drake was placed in South Africa, people are more likely to see him as mixed race. Some may even consider him colored, which is its own racial community in South Africa. Now, the idea of race has existed for millennia. One group sees another group that is distinct from their own, that looks slightly different from them, and they consider them and their peers a different race. But the way we define race nowadays has a lot more to do with Europeans and how they categorize people with the conquests of different European nations. Many people believed that race was biological, and some thought that different races were different species, and it was used to justify acts of oppression by the European powers. Believing that race is biological rather than a social construct is something that we now call scientific racism or race realism, which pretty much says that humans' quote unquote race was based on their skull shape. And that's how you get terms like Negroid or Mongoloid, Caucasoid, Australoid, etc. Now, some of you may be wondering, how is this racist? I was taught this. And I won't lie, I've seen a lot of grown people, grown men and women, talk about these quote unquote races many times, and it's a shame because this idea of race realism has been denounced by the scientific community since the 1940s, with anthropologist Franz Boas and biologists Julian Huxley and Lancelot Hogben being some of the earlier critics of race realism. In the 1950s, UNESCO released The Race Question, reading, "The biological fact of race and the myth of race should be distinguished. For all practical purposes, race is not so much a biological phenomenon as a social myth." So, why does race not exist? A Nigerian man is genetically different from a Swedish man. 99% of their genes are the same, whereas 0.1% of their DNA is responsible for their physical differences, their differences in skin color, hair texture, and even athletic ability. In our society, the Nigerian man is a black man. An Ethiopian man is also black in our society, yet the average Habesha Ethiopian is actually genetically more closely related to many Middle Eastern groups than they are to a Nigerian Igbo man, for example. Because around half of Habesha DNA comes from ancient migrations from Natufian related people over thousands of years, being a mix of both West Eurasian and Sub Saharan African DNA. But that doesn't make them any less black in the US or even Canada. We don't see Middle Easterners as black, but we see Habesha people who are around 50% or even less African as black. Meaning, race isn't about genetic makeup, it is about how we view people and their features. Africa is the most genetically diverse continent in the world, but to us, all native sub Saharan Africans are black. It's like the example I made with Drake. Most of his DNA is not African, but we see him as a black person because of his features and how that society decides to categorize him and people that look like him. Race is completely defined by the specific society and their categorizations. Like I've mentioned before, South African colored people are their own racial categorization. but it has two meanings. Someone that is mixed, usually with black and white or Indian or Malay, is colored, like Trevor Noah or Tyla. But colored is also a very specific community in South Africa, like the Cape Coloreds, who are descendants of hundreds of years of mixing of the native people in the West. These people are likely to be seen just as black, but not in South Africa. Ethnicity is also a social construct. However, there is much more of a correlation biologically with ethnicity and genetics, but this depends on the community. For example, many would consider Latino as an ethnicity. Latinos are from Latin America, and the Latino identity exists because of Spanish colonialism, with Latin American people being very diverse. The average Latino is mixed, usually with indigenous American, Spanish, and even African. Most Mexicans are mestizo, mixed with indigenous and Spanish. Dominicans are usually African and Spanish. Peruvian Latinos are majority indigenous with a smaller percentage of Spanish DNA, whereas Argentinians have high rates of Italian and Spanish DNA. Even though there's a lot of genetic diversity in this region, they are all considered Latino. Same thing with Arabs. An Arab from Saudi Arabia is genetically very different from an Arab from the Levant or an Arab from the Maghreb. A Moroccan person that identifies as Arab will have majority of their DNA from Amazigh populations. Arabs from the Levant, like Lebanon or Palestine, will have majority of their DNA from ancient Levantine populations. Most of these now Arab groups became Arabized with the spread of Islamic dynasties post 7th century. This was much more of a linguistic and cultural shift than a genetic one. Obviously, there are some exceptions, like how modern Sudanese people can trace around half of their DNA from Arabian Peninsular people. But for most Arab populations, they are not heavily mixed with Arabian Peninsular DNA, but language is many times what unifies people and creates ethnic identities. These are all social constructs. In conclusion, race is not a fixed biological reality, but a fluid and socially constructed system of classification rooted in historical, cultural, and political forces. What one society sees as two people of the same race, another may see as entirely different groups, revealing that our understanding of race depends more on context and perception than on genetics. Despite what pseudoscientific theories once claimed, modern science has shown that genetic differences between so called races are minimal and do not justify the rigid categories that society imposes. Our fixation on physical traits, shaped by colonial histories and power structures, has led to deeply ingrained systems of inequality and misunderstanding. Recognizing race as a social construct doesn't erase its real world impact. It helps us understand that these categories were created, not discovered, and can be dismantled. Only by understanding these myths can we move toward a more accurate and equitable understanding of human diversity.